thanks for coming out on this cold and unbelievably snowy evening in mid-late October. Anyway, I'll be chairing this evening's meeting, and just to make sure you're at the right meeting, it's the special after the election neoliberal crisis or neoconservative advance strategies for the left. We have, and the fourth speaker has now arrived, so we have four very interesting and capable speakers to talk about the results of last week's elections and where the left goes from here. First, I'd like to, I've already thanked you for coming out on this snowy evening. I'd also like to thank the speakers who are very busy people for taking some time to prepare for this meeting and show up and speak here with us this evening. So, I won't say much. We have four speakers to get through. I've asked them to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes each, after which we'll go to the floor for questions and comments, and we'll try to squeeze in as many rounds of back and forth between the panel and all of you here this evening. Oh, my name is Raghu. Yeah, thanks. I try to be a self-effacing chair, so self-effacing, but with an iron fist if people go over their time limit or speak too long on the floor. So I don't really have any introductory remarks. I think everyone knows why we're here. We had the federal election last week. I think this evening's meeting is sponsored by the Socialist Project. I know the Socialist Project definitely believes that one thing that is sorely lacking is a space, really, for the radical and activist left to discuss things like elections, and more importantly, to organize some type of intervention, campaigning intervention and action in the context of elections and before and after elections. So we're hoping that this is a modest contribution to the type of debate on and discussion on strategy and tactics and so forth that should be taking place. On that note, I will start. I believe Tam said she'd like to speak first.
Sure.
And so we have Tam Goossen, who is a research associate at the Asian Institute of Vermont Center, board of directors of the Community Social Planning Council of Toronto, and former president of the Urban Alliance on Race Relations.
Right,
so over to you,
right.
Tam. 10 to 15 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here to have this share this cold evening with you. I just have to go up to face the winter. But I'd like to go back in time very quickly. I grew up in Hong Kong in the 50s and 60s, and the concept of political engagement was far from a positive ideal. Being a British colony sharing a porous border with China that was undergoing intense political struggles, Hong Kong was a destination for Chinese economic and political refugees. As well, it was a fierce battleground for forces supporting either China, the communists, or Taiwan, the Kuomintang, the nationalists, each with their own propaganda machine, schools, and cheering squads. On more than one occasion, I remember, the escalating tension between China and Taiwan would stoke the fire, and serious fights would break out in the streets in Hong Kong. Ordinary Hong Kong citizens would be caught in the middle, and the colonial government would try their best to put out the fire. That's also when Hong Kong Chinese started queuing up in front of the Canadian consulate to apply for immigration papers. As a result, most of us were taught by our parents and also by the semi-public school system to be politically indifferent, and largely as a means of self-protection and survival. Any hint of being associated with either side was likely to have grave consequences for our livelihood. After I immigrated to Toronto, I was determined to find out what democracy was all about. I eagerly joined a political party, participated in election campaigns at all levels, and even put my name forward 4 times for public office. And against my own nature, I had to learn to be political and partisan. Luckily for me, though, I never saw electoral politics as the only expression of democratic ideals. I understood early on the power of the grassroots, parents, students, teachers, community workers, or concerned citizens. When they work together on a common issue that they care deeply about, they take the lead and politicians follow. Earlier, there was the success of the grassroots women's movement. It was totally opened our eyes. More locally and recently, it was through the grassroots organizations that the teaching of the controversial heritage languages and black cultural program was initiated at the former Toronto Board of Education and also became provincial policy later on. It's also true with the employment equity policy, which was a public policy first at the Toronto Board and also later on at the provincial level. And so this perspective that saved me from going through a severe post-election problem of watching my parents' levels running Ottawa again. That has been said that really it has been said that there are really no real winners in the last week's election results. The seat gains and losses are almost meaningless for those of us, for a lot of the people who have nothing to do with the political fortunes of political parties. Yes, we could demand proportional representation, but I'm not holding my breath. And I will also say that for most of us on the ground, except for personal feelings for favorite candidates who lost or for the unfavorite candidates who won, the results don't really make much difference to us on the ground working. Because despite the scary and sad political reality in Ottawa, there are other political bodies that matter more to us who live in the city. What's more is that we lived through this before. There was Mike Harris. When he came to power, that scared the daylights out of us. So through learning how to cope with that, we became very creative and resourceful. And in the process, we also learned how to put our differences aside to fight the real enemy, Mike Harris. I hope you all remember that time. And there has been very successful campaigns. The list actually is quite long, and I would just like to include, there's the campaign for public education. Remember that? There was a really concerted and broad-based campaign to fight back all the draconian changes that Mike Harris brought to the amalgamated school system. And they were successful. And there's Fair Deal for the City, Stand Up for Toronto, Fight Back Again to push back on the provincial downloading onto the municipalities. Minimum Wage Campaign, again, a very successful campaign, and in pushing for much improved provincial legislation. And it was a great community mobilizing campaign. There was the Hotel Workers Rising campaign, and a lot of the community folks joined the hotel workers to demand respect and better working conditions. Anti-poverty campaign, successful in getting a spot on the government agenda, although we don't know how it's going to turn out yet. And then right now there's the Good Jobs Coalition. We've been working since earlier this year. The idea is to get talking about how to improve living and working conditions for all Canadians. There's a summit being planned for November 22nd. I hope John brought some flyers, but there's a website for goodjobscoalition.ca. So these campaigns are characterized by a strong belief that progressive forces in the community as well as in the labor movement have to work together to address serious issues facing all of us. It's imperative that folks at the grassroots level are at the table from the beginning rather than being thought of, being invited as an afterthought. Justice for all is the key battle cry, and inclusion is the glue that binds all of us together. And these are of paramount importance. The way this is going, I would say that community coalition building could and should show the way for all the political parties on the left. They need to learn from us how to put aside their partisanship, their egos, and their exclusionary and hierarchical ways. None of them should merit our unconditional support unless they learn how to work together to stop Harper from turning this country, turning all of us into strangers in this country. So let the forces be with us.
Move on now to Judy Rebick. I don't think Judy needs an introduction, although I'll give you one. Judy is Sam Gindin, CAW Chair in Social Justice and Democracy at the School of Social Work in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Ryerson University, and former, I believe, editor-in-chief of and publisher of Rabble.ca. Sorry, Rabble.ca publisher. I'm sorry. So
Thank you.
10 to 15 minutes.
Okay, so first, I hope everybody will come to the Rabble relaunch. You know, one of the success stories of the left is Rabble. We launched it in 2001. It's still around. It's growing, and everybody should come. Okay, so I'm going to start with something I never do, which is a kind of could-have, would-have, should-have thing, which is if the NPI had been successful in new politics initiatives, we probably would be celebrating a breakthrough for the left. But anyway, it's not. I think it's because it's not the time that would happen. So, but anyway, it's nice to fantasize about it. Okay, so I want to just say a few things about the election. One is that I don't think there's been a very clear analysis of what happened in Quebec, and we all realize that Quebec saved us from a Tory majority. But the important thing to realize is that when the people in Quebec turned away from the Tories, they did not turn to the NDP, they turned back to the Liberals, whose vote had collapsed in Quebec. This is a very important fact that is not being analyzed at all, because the NDP put a lot of energy and effort into Quebec, and they had some key people there, some good people. And still, the vote that didn't go to the PQ, that is the Federalist vote, that was parked with the Tories for a while, went to the Liberals, not the NDP. And I think that says something very important for the NDP in terms of their strategy. And I don't think that they'll ever make that breakthrough into Quebec because of the history of lack of trust and how many times they've betrayed Quebec on the national question. We can talk about that in the discussion if people want. So I think what happened in this election is really that the Liberals waged an incredibly weak campaign, that the NDP was not able to benefit from that in any significant way. They only went up 1 percentage point in popular vote, despite the fact that they gained seats. The Greens benefited to a degree, but not also, given the weakness of the Liberal campaign and the weakness of the Liberal leadership, not very strong either. So I think what's important to do is take a step back and say what, and the biggest news was that despite the fear-mongering in the campaign, which I think much of which was justified on the side of the left in terms of what a Harper majority would do to this country, but also the fear-mongering on the right against Dion in particular, people voted with their feet, 59% turnout. I mean, that's like American levels of voting. So I think we have to look at that and look at why. And I agree with Tam, actually, completely, that people are really fed up with the sterile partisanship in Parliament and the fact that there's no real debates on anything. For example, a good example is on climate change. I mean, the Liberals put forward a carbon tax. The NDP and the Bloc put forward a cap and trade. There was no real debate. There was no debate. All there was a denunciation of carbon tax, which served, in fact, to make people less willing to make sacrifices around the environment, right? Which the NDP participated in. So there was no debate about climate change. There was no debate about the economic crisis, except whether Harper was going to do something about it or not do something about it. Basically, I think what we're seeing is the complete discrediting of electoral politics among the populace, and the people who vote are either people who are active or people who are partisan. And I think we saw a number of things which was really amazing, like the extent of this. I don't agree with strategic voting at all, so I put that out there. If somebody does, I'd be happy to debate it. Because because I don't think we should consider the Liberals to be a left-wing party. I mean, I'm getting to the point I don't consider the NDP to be a left-wing party. But I mean, the Liberals have never been. They always run on the left and govern on the right. Now Dion is probably on the left of the party for sure, and I think he is genuinely committed to doing something on the environment, which is an important one of the key issues of division in this election. But and also you can't trust the Liberals at all ever. So to do what they're going to say or what they run on. So for that reason, I don't agree with strategic voting. As people know, I put forward during the election the idea of some kind of accord. And the reason why I think that's better than strategic, there's two reasons why I think it's better, and I'll tell you why I did that. One is because it allows for a written agreement as to what the government has to do to stay in power. This is how we got pay equity in Ontario, was through an accord. And two, because it's actually active and possible to achieve. Strategic voting is hit and miss. It's very difficult. Unless the parties engage in strategic voting, it's almost impossible to make it happen and to make it work. Even with the sophisticated websites, and we had 2 websites that you could put your postal code in and find out if you were in a whatever they called the swing riding, and it didn't work. It really didn't work. If you look at the ridings that they targeted, which they based on last election results, they didn't turn out to be the ridings that were close at all. So it didn't work, and it was very sophisticated. But what I want to point out is a couple of things. The first thing is the community of artists mobilized and played a major role in the election. I've never seen that before. I mean, Margaret Atwood being sort of one of the key public intellectuals, and Margaret Atwood saying, "I'd vote for the Bloc Québécois if I lived in Quebec." Like, this is not insignificant in a country where the national question has been as divisive as it's been, that a leading cultural figure in the country basically says this is how much he thinks Harper would destroy the country, that she'd vote Bloc Québécois. I think that was very important. And I think the coalition of artists that formed and the activism of artists through this campaign was really something significant we hadn't seen before. And I think we have to think about how to relate to that, how to as activists, and how to work with those coalitions of artists that have been forming now around the war, anti-war stuff, and now through this. I think that was a very positive thing in the election. I think I love the vote swapping thing. I mean, I think it didn't work, but I thought it was brilliant and funny, and using the net in the way that it should be used through by networking. And I don't know if people know how this vote swapping thing worked, but you would identify your riding that you were willing to vote swap, and then they'd introduce you to someone, then you'd chat with them and talk to them about whether you trusted them or not, whether you agreed with them politically, and so on. And so it was a way of a meetup over discussing politics on Facebook. And I think that was a really great idea for that, because people were talking to each other about politics in the course of the election. So I think, that what we saw in this election was a kind of militant nonpartisanship among a lot of people. It was almost a movement that said the stakes are too high for us to be partisan. Now, if I was taking my old position on the NDP, which I know a lot of people in this room share, and that is that it's a Labour Party, it represents the working class, and therefore it is distinguished in that way from all the other parties, then we would see that as a bad thing. And I don't see it as a good thing that people don't distinguish between the NDP and the Liberals very much at all. However, I do not believe the NDP is any longer a Labour Party in any real sense of the word. I think that their relationship with the Labour movement is basically very bureaucratic and not related at all to most grassroots workers. And I think that they don't see themselves accountable to the labor movement, and that hasn't been the case for a long time. So I don't see. So therefore, that's the argument that no doubt we'll have in the discussion period. So I think this nonpartisanship is not about not wanting to take a stand. It's about how sterile electoral politics have become, and how little people see in the actions of any party, even though I thought Jack Layton waged a very good campaign in the context of how these campaigns get run. I think people are really fed up with the sterility of partisan politics and the whole, professional sort of, how many times Jack said kitchen table, kitchen table, kitchen table. Like people aren't stupid, right? Like, that doesn't, I don't think it works, So, and I think if you talk to people like they're intelligent, they actually respond to that. And I think, whatever differences we might have about Barack Obama, that is what he is doing. He is talking to people like they have brains in their heads, and that maybe they might think once once or twice, and people are reacting massively to that. Massively. You know, in a country where people were completely turning away from electoral politics, they're reacting to someone who seems genuine, who seems like he's talking to them, who seems like he's thinking, who seems like he thinks they're thinking. And I think that we have to break out of, not we, but I mean the NDP, if it's going to go anywhere, has to break out of this kind of politics. And I think that, and I'll end on this, I think that in this election, other than the campaign, there was two campaigns that, you know, we have in Canada always had very strong social movement campaigns during elections on issues. And in this election, the only two campaigns I saw was one on climate change, which was actually quite ineffectual because it was the power up thing and it was completely nonpartisan, and I don't think it had any impact. And the other was the strategic voting campaign. And other than that, I didn't see any social campaigns that really, now maybe I missed something because I wasn't out there. I was working on my book, so I wasn't really out there very much. But I didn't see any big campaigns on issues during the election. And I think that reflects the demobilization of the movements. And I think that's the biggest problem that we face. I agree. I have a slightly different assessment than Tam. Usually I'm the optimist. I'm not as optimistic. I think we have a very demobilized social movements and social organizations. So I think that for me, and I just finished a book where I've looked at social movements and electoral politics, and I think that the you know, we just have to rethink how we do politics in many, many ways. And it's just not working anymore at an electoral level at all to engage people. And the last thing I want to say is PR. Probably more discussion about proportional representation after this election than I've ever seen before. And, you know, Fair Vote, I've been involved in Fair Vote Canada for a long time. Fair Vote Canada, in my opinion, needs help. It needs to expand itself. It needs to be more popular. It needs to be more sexy or something, you know, a little more able to reach out. It's too policy wonky. It's not reaching out to people. And so if there's anybody in this room who can get involved in Fair Vote Canada, I think it would be a very good thing for people, because I think there's a stronger impetus coming out of this election for PR, and I agree, we're not likely to get it from the Tories, but still, you build a movement, it takes time. I think now's a time to really move on broadening the movement for proportional representation, because it's still very narrow. So I don't think it's the end of the, okay, so on the last, on the question asked, and I'll end on this, the question asked. You know, it's kind of weird, like, we're actually quite behind the United States now. This is my analysis, which is that, you know, they got ravaged by neoliberalism starting in the 70s and the 80s, and we resisted it. So we resisted it a lot longer than almost anywhere, actually. And so we didn't get hit really bad in Canada by neoliberalism, except in the textile industry till Paris came in. And so as a result, we're kind of behind everybody else in terms of developing a response to neoliberalism. And now neoliberalism, I wouldn't say it's collapsing, but it's in massive crisis. I don't know if you saw The Economist, but The Economist this week had, it was called Capitalism at Bay, and it had a wolf baying full of arrows in its rear end. I was going to write them a letter to the editor and saying, probably it should have had self-inflicted bites, not an arrow. So neoliberalism in crisis, not from any resistance, but from its own greed and lack of any kind of controls. And so there's the problem, of course, is that there's, other than in Latin America, there's no political force that's presenting an alternative. And so how this will resolve itself is unclear. But what is clear to me is that it's much easier now in a mainstream way to start talking about socialism again, to start talking about you know, collective solutions, to start talking much more, I'm talking about mainstream now, to talk about what went wrong with the system and not let them get away with what they're trying, well, the right wing's trying to get away with saying, you know, it's the fault of the poor people who bought houses and they couldn't afford it, right? I don't think that's going to go very far. But even to get away with just talking about re-regulation, which they will do, they have to do. But to talk about what permitted a system, one, what permitted the system, what kind of society allows this to happen, and two, how easy they found $700 billion to bail out the banks when they can't find, you know, a fraction of that to feed the poor of the world or to, you know, whatever. We all know what the question is, and to try and get that debate to happen somehow, which I think only the movements will really do. So I'll end it there.
All right, thanks, Judy. We'll now move on to Grace Edward Galabuzi, Associate Professor, Department of Politics and Public Administration at Ryerson University. 10 to 15 minutes. Grace Edward.
Thank you. Try and keep it to 15, yes. I think that I agree with much of what Judy has said and Tam. Not all, but much of it. The way I want to approach this is to, first of all, suggest that I thought that this was we're in a key moment, and that the election in some ways and the outcome of the election, two elections, the last two elections, represent in some ways an indication of a crisis in the political elite that may be directly related to where the organization of our economy is. And that in this moment, I think that this is a moment of economic and financial crisis. It's a moment of some degree of political crisis. Our structures of governance failed us miserably. It is assumed that in a liberal democratic society, elections are supposed to judge the powers of the people and impose the popular will of the electorate on those who govern. At least that's the theory that's been drummed in our heads since grade school. Yet, even as the financial markets were melting and the state was being asked by capital to socialize the risks of casino capitalism, this past election came and went without any fundamental discussion or challenge to the organization of the economy that is generating more inequality, increased income polarization, economic marginalization, more and more poverty as the ranks of the working poor swell out of proportion, and it is an economy that is generalizing precarious conditions of not just work, but also existence in our communities. And so I think that this is a moment within which we should have been demanding more of our political leaders. It is a moment within which we need to challenge the dominant narrative about how the economy is organized. And I think it is an opportunity also, and I'll speak to that. It's an opportunity, I think, for us to talk about how we need to build movement power from below, so that we can articulate an alternative narrative of how the economy ought to be organized so that it works not just for a few, but for more and more of us, and not just the economy, but also our political system and political structures and political processes reinforce what essentially ought to be a democratization of economic organization. So it is, I think, really important and I think timely for us to be talking about neoliberalism and the extent to which it is implicated in the events that we're talking about, as well as the nature of economic processes and political forces and ideological discourses that have emerged and are responsible in many ways for creating the material conditions and the excesses and contradictions that we face today. So I want to look specifically at what I see as the outcomes of this process within the Canadian context, but I want to start from a somewhat macro level of analysis, because I think it is really important for us to engage this stuff if we are going to put out an alternative narrative of how the economy ought to be organized. We need to follow through the process of completely delegitimizing the neoliberal project by articulating what it was, how it came to be, and the crisis that it has provoked, and so that we can move on to talking about alternatives. I think that so we're in a moment where the potential for social action to respond is very real, because I think the space has been opened up because of the crisis in the neoliberal project. So contrary to what we have heard often about neoliberalism, it was not this sort of singular moment of triumph over the past 25 to 30 years that neoliberalism has been on. I think that there are nuances. I think that over this period of time, as neoliberalism has maintained a grip over our society, there's been a degree to which we're looking at differentiated moments. I think that you can look at an early moment, maybe 70s and 80s, where what you had was a growing and clear dominance of neoliberalism, as it used its position of supremacy to direct the affairs of societies to ensure maximum accumulation. But because of the predatory nature of these processes, contrary to the assurances of trickle-down economic growth and well-being, the realities of people's lives on the ground increasingly led to the questioning of the legitimacy of the project as the contradictions provoked mobilizations from below. Now, these mobilizations clearly responding to the predatory excesses of neoliberalism have happened for close to about 20 years, in especially countries in the South. When Judy talks about the United States getting to that neoliberal moment before we did, the reality is that countries in the South and countries in the East were at that moment even sooner than the United States did. And that the process of disciplining labor, which I'll talk about, was made possible by the crisis that neoliberalism provoked in those societies. And so that essentially happened. But there is a second moment that I think is really important that to this analysis, and that is a recognition of the extent to which, partly because of how predatory it was, how excessive it was, there was a response from people from below. People started to push back. There was a challenge. In many ways, it cost people's lives as communities organized and responded in very significant ways. And as that happened, neoliberalism actually started to accommodate itself to these responses. It started to accommodate itself to these responses by seeking for some kind of strategic compromise that will allow it to continue to accumulate, to allow capital to continue to accumulate, while on the other hand, allowing for some space to release some of that pressure that was building. And so I think that is important, because I think it is precisely that we need to build upon. But also understand that it also represents the possibility of the tremendous mobilization that has been happening over the last 15 to 20 years, and is happening even within the Canadian context, that it can be co-opted. That there's a real potential for a co-optation and a reassertion of a mode of neoliberalism that accommodates itself in some ways to the pressures that are coming from below, maintains the basic structure and logic without necessarily addressing the excesses and the implications of those excesses on the ground. So when we start to hear the talk about sustainable development, and we start to hear the talk about corporate social responsibility, and other people have referred to this as stakeholder capitalism, right? That in some ways represents this possibility of an accommodation that might release some of the valves, maintain the best structures, and at the end of the day, ensure the persistence of neoliberalism. So I think that it is really important for us to understand that. The alternative then would be the possibility of challenging the logic, the essential logic of neoliberalism. And here's what, let me just spend a bit more time on that question before I move on to talking about the Canadian context. One is that what we had in the 1970s, late 1960s, 1970s, is a crisis in the infrastructure of production and accumulation. And that crisis in some ways led to an opening for capital to reimpose what essentially it always had wanted to do, a logic that allowed it to spread this crisis outside of the nation-state boundaries internationally. So the shifting of modes of production that became more international was in some ways the spreading of that crisis. What it did is that it allowed for the capital to reestablish a form of economic regulation that ensured that it could continue to accumulate, but that this had profound effect on the lives of people, not just in the North, but also in the South. In some ways, people thought that this process was really about taking jobs to the South. And what happened is that there were mobilizations within countries like Canada and the United States and Europe amongst working people that were aimed at stopping those processes because they saw them as creating jobs, taking jobs out of the country in the South. But if you looked at what was happening in the South, the reality was that this was not some kind of bonanza that was that people in the South were benefiting from these realignments. The reality is that in many of those countries, national government and the national projects that were aimed at developing those societies were essentially destroyed. And many of those societies were then subject to very predatory forms of economic organization, which meant that they were now much weaker, could not challenge capitalism at the international global level. And that then meant that we were also subsequently weaker because they were forcing us into this idea of the lowest common denominator. I think, though, that that is not all that was happening, and I think that the massive IMF strikes and riots in the South that have been written about, the challenges to the World Bank model of development that has been written about, all of that suggests that people did not simply sit back and accept this. People challenged what the neoliberal project was about. And I think that for me that is where the hope has been and is and continues to be. And I think that is the starting point in terms of understanding how we need to respond. Part of what we need to do is to expand our reach in terms of in terms of creating a vision of response to what is happening in the South. What Capital did very effectively is it co-opted the elites in the South in this process. What we probably need to be thinking about is figuring out how we strengthen our relations with those who were victims of this process in the South and who have been rising up against neoliberalism, so that we can have we can also have a sort of transnational or global response to these challenges. Okay, I think that in the Canadian context, what we had as an outcome of this process is a radical redistribution of wealth and power. We see that in terms of the data on income polarization. We see that in terms of the concentration of wealth into fewer and fewer hands. But we also see that in the workplace, in the way that work is organized and the extent to which we have less control over work and less ability to bargain collectively. We also see it in the growth of flexibility, the demands for flexibility in terms of organization of work. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives published a report recently, and many of you will be familiar with this, titled "The Rich and the Rest of Us, the Changing Face of Canada's Growing Gap." And in the report, they suggest a number of really interesting things. One is that from 1981 to 2005, when they were writing, the Canadian economy doubled in size. It is now the 9th largest economy in the world. But when you scratch that growth, when you scratch the picture of the growth, what you find is that in spite of the fact that the economy doubled and we were so much more productive and we created all this wealth, wages have flatlined mostly, over that period of time. We have an increase in the number of people who are working but poor, right? We have a crisis in certain sectors of our population, too. We have a crisis in certain sectors of our population, amongst those who are most vulnerable, amongst women, amongst racialized groups, amongst Aboriginal people, amongst persons with disabilities. We have a crisis at a time when we have expanded our wealth base so substantially. We have a crisis. We have a crisis in terms of the provision of social services, whether that is healthcare or education or services in the communities. We have all these crises. It makes no sense. The only way to understand that is from the point of view of understanding the extent to which all of that growth has actually led to this radical, very radical redistribution of wealth. And so what I expected the leaders of the various political parties, especially the ones in the opposition, to do, is to zero in on this incredible, radical project of redistributing wealth as the basis for challenging the dominant mode of economic organization. Unfortunately, that did not happen. I mean, and this is, for me, the saddest thing. Not even the NDP seriously challenged the nature of the economy that is not working for most of us. And I think that is, not only is that a missed opportunity, but it says something about the NDP, and in that respect I agree with Judy with regard to where the NDP is at. So I could go through the figures in terms of this very radical redistribution and what it means in terms of work. But let me just say a couple of things. One is the reality of most people's lives is that they are more job insecure today than they were even during the period of crisis in the early 1980s. That in the early 1980s, what you had is that a segment of the population, unemployment was high, a segment of the population was both job insecure and having trouble having access to the labor market. Today, you have a much broader part of the population that is highly job insecure, that are existing in very precarious conditions, both in terms of their access to the labor market, but also in terms of their lives. And all of this clearly does not compute. And so I am told that I should wind down. So let me just say a couple of things. One is that
wind up, Grace.
Wind up. I thought it was winding down. A couple of things. One is that I think one of the places we really have to go in terms of getting a handle on this is to look at the sort of the ideological impetus that involves the normalization of these very gross processes. And you know, the media has been very good at this. They're constantly pointing at the stock market and how well it's doing. They are talking about, Diane Francis is writing about how many more millionaires we have created, and that she says, by the way, they are all not white anymore. Some of them are people of color, and some of them are women, so this is, we are almost there. Right? So the focus has been on that, on understanding how successful we are as a society from the point of view of how many millionaires we have created, from the point of view of how well the stock market is doing. The reality is starkly different on the ground, and I think that we need to both confront the ideological imperative that leads to the normalization of that as the central and the dominant narrative. I think the other thing we need to do is to talk about how the idea that the economy is global, and so we have no control here because of being in competition with people who are thousands of miles away, plays into this logic. And that as we think about responses and alternatives, we need to put on the table again the possibility of organizing the economy in such a way that we have some control, which means that we need to think about how to localize the economy and processes of production. We need to re-embed the economy within the society and the imperatives of society that are very local. I think to some extent this is happening in many parts of Latin America. The people are making the case that we have to have control over the economy and the mode of organization of the economy. So that increasingly, I think that as we look for alternatives, we need to look in the direction of not necessarily smaller, but certainly, especially as we move towards a more green economy, we need to talk about how we need to organize the economy in such a way that we have greater control, both in the workplace, which means that we need to organize and unionize it in the workplace, but also in our communities, which means we need to democratize processes of economic organization. So let me leave it at that.